People were not in agreement. They were being careful. I think a lot of leaders misunderstand that distinction. You see, for years, I thought silence in meetings meant alignment. I would explain my expectations, I'd outline the direction, open the floor for questions, and when nobody challenged anything, I took that as confirmation that I'd communicated successfully, that my message landed, that everyone agreed with what I was saying, and stuff would go as planned. People nodded in meetings, moved on. Then the plans would start to break down later. Concerns surfaced halfway through implementation. Operational problems that nobody mentioned earlier suddenly became visible. And honestly, someone would say, almost 100% of the time, I knew this was going to happen. I knew that was a bad idea. Or I knew that would be a problem earlier on. At first, I interpreted that as a performance issue. I thought people were either not listening carefully, they were sabotaging things I was trying to do, they weren't following through. Looking back, I think it was something else happening. People weren't not asking questions because they had clarity. They were trying to assess what honesty might cost them at that time. And I think a lot of organizations quietly confuse that silence, which is actual caution, with a healthy culture. And this is especially true inside environments where decisiveness, confidence, speed of decisions are constantly rewarded. Meetings move quickly. Leaders are expected to have the answers. Operational pressures, they compress conversations. Over time, organizations can start to mistake consensus for real alignment. I think a lot of executives live inside that confusion without fully realizing it. George Bernard Shaw said, "The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place." Story of my life sometimes. The older I get, the more I think organizations operate inside that illusion constantly. A leader explains the direction. People nod. Nobody pushes back. No one asks meaningful questions. No one challenges everything. The meeting ends, and everybody leaves assuming that communication has happened, that alignment was reached. Everyone agrees on the consensus. Good to go. Then 2 weeks later, reality exposes something completely different. I used to think, why the heck didn't people speak up earlier when the problem was first recognized? But now I think the better question is, well, what environment was I created in that room that made honesty feel risky in the first place? Because most employees don't suddenly stop having opinions, stop having concerns. Usually they become more aware of the consequences attached to sharing those concerns out loud. And that shift becomes especially noticeable when people are around authority. I remember sitting inside meetings where I could almost feel people in the room reading everyone's faces to decide whether it was safe to contribute. Sometimes they softened disagreement before they actually reached the actual point they were trying to make. Others would glance at senior leadership almost instinctively before speaking, as if to kind of say, I'm evaluating whether it's worth being transparent right now and what tension it might create. And sometimes people waited till afterward, that dreaded meeting after the meeting. I had more conversations in hallways or parking lots or phone calls after the meeting than I had during the meetings. And that always stayed with me because eventually I started realizing the real issue was not communication skills alone. I was more concerned with crafting my message, how I was going to be received, how well written an email was, or how well spoken the message was, which I was never really very good at that anyway. The real issue was whether or not people felt safe enough to communicate honestly inside the environment that I had created. I think many leaders underestimate that significance. When honesty is consistently relocated outside of the meetings, the culture is telling you something. Early in my career, I didn't realize how much my presence would impact the behavior of people around me. I thought being direct automatically created clarity. I thought intensity communicated standards and authority. I thought that pressure would sharpen people and push people to achieve their best. Sometimes maybe it did. I think most of the time it just made people more guarded around me. And there's a difference. You see, pressure changes how people think, especially sustained pressure combined with the hierarchy inside organizations. Over time, people stop focusing entirely on solving the problem itself and start thinking about how leadership will react to raising concerns. That shift is subtle. Questions become less frequent. Alternative perspectives aren't shared. Maybe meetings start feeling cleaner. Maybe they're more efficient. From the outside, that can even resemble strong leadership for a while. But underneath the surface, something else is already deteriorating. People become careful instead of honest. And the difficult part is organizations can still produce results in that environment for a long period of time, sometimes forever. The metrics are good, deadlines are being met, financial performance is still strong. That's why some leaders never even fully recognize what's happening around them or never even have a reason to appreciate it. The organization is adapting around those leaders, and employees learn which conversations feel safe. They learn which conversations create tension. They learn when honesty is welcomed and when it's going to cost them. Eventually, teams stop bringing leadership their most honest thinking, their best thinking, and start bringing in the safe thinking instead, which is usually just agreement. There's a major difference between those two cultures. And one of the more important leadership adjustments I made over time was changing how I invited discussion. I stopped ending conversations with any questions, look around the room. I wasn't really asking if they had questions. It was a rhetorical question. Usually by the time I asked that question, the discussion felt finished. I was ready to move on. And most people recognized that immediately. But eventually I started asking questions differently. I invited conversation. Say, gang, what am I missing here? What concerns do you have? What are we not discussing? Where am I not seeing problems? Are there assumptions that I have that are wrong? And then I learned something else that mattered even more. Silence. The kind of silence that feels uncomfortable in the room. Actual silence long enough to become more uncomfortable than simply speaking up. People would speak up to break the silence. That changed the quality of conversations more than any other practice I did. That had a massive impact on the feedback I would get. Because eventually someone always speaks up. And many times, once one person has the courage to speak up, others will speak up. And that's a good thing. I can't count how many operational landmines were avoided because of those conversations that happened after the silence. And if we would have ignored them, it would have been so much more expensive to address later on. Some of the strongest initiatives that I was a part of came from discussions where my original thinking was challenged directly. Early in my career, I admit I didn't really enjoy those conversations very much, but looking back, it was refinement happening in real time. Proverbs 27 says, "As iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another." I understand now how much that verse applies to leadership. Sharpening creates friction. Healthy friction is often what prevents much larger consequences later on. But authority changes how much friction people are willing to risk around you. I think it's one of the most dangerous aspects of leadership sometimes. The more authority someone carries, the easier it becomes for disagreement to slowly disappear around them, while that leader mistakes that silence for confidence in the direction, for consensus, for alignment. One of the more important lessons I learned about communication actually came from receiving difficult feedback myself. Someone I respected a great deal confronted me about issues years ago, and maybe the feedback itself was accurate. Almost immediately, my attention shifted away from what they were actually saying, and I became protective of myself. My guard was up. I remember thinking afterward, I don't really remember what feedback they were trying to give me, but I did not like how diminished I felt by the delivery itself. And that experience stayed with me because it exposed something I had not fully appreciated, that people don't only respond to what you say, they respond to who they become while hearing it. Do they feel thoughtful? Are they careful? Do they get defensive? Do they feel invited to conversations or discussions? Or do they simply just feel managed through it? See, leadership shapes internal experiences constantly, whether you acknowledge it or not. And I think many executives underestimate how deeply atmosphere affects organizational transparency. If people consistently associate disagreement with embarrassment, tension, or any kind of consequence, eventually they'll stop sharing their opinions. Not because they stopped having an opinion, not because they stopped caring, usually because they're adapting. And honestly, I think it's one of the quieter, very common ways that organizations begin to deteriorate from the inside. It rarely announces itself dramatically. Most of the time, it just looks like professionalism. Smooth meetings, efficient, fast agreement, consensus is reached, people sound increasingly polished around each other, all while saying less at the same time, until eventually nobody's saying the things that need to be said in the first place. I now find myself less interested in whether people agree with what I'm saying, and more interested in whether people are able to think around me, think out loud, think honestly around me. That became a far more meaningful leadership measure for me, because many of the most expensive organizational problems that I've seen, They're visible much earlier inside conversations that leadership just wasn't a part of. They were a part of the meeting after the meeting, the concerns people were sharing in the hallway, the whispers behind the leader's back. And those signs were usually there if you paid close attention. Questions weren't common, meetings were cleaner, while conversation became thinner. People started managing personalities more than they were managing problems. And from the outside, the organization often still looked functional. Internally, though, people had already begun protecting themselves from the environment that leadership was creating. I think healthy culture is often misunderstood because many organizations define healthy by the absence of friction, the absence of conflict, of problems. I no longer think that's true. See, a healthy culture isn't afraid of the friction. It's not afraid of difficult conversations. It's not afraid of disagreement. A healthy culture is an environment where people can productively share their honest opinions without fearing any consequence for doing so. And that doesn't mean every opinion is right. It doesn't mean that leaders stop making the decisions. It doesn't mean that organizations become passives and just try to manage to the consensus. That's not what I'm saying. What it means, though, is truth matters more than ego. And we want opinions to be shared more than we want to protect our ego that consensus is reached right away, that we are right out of the gate. And I think organizations quietly rise or fall on that distinction more than leaders realize.